Order, order. Before I call Hilary Benn, can I simply say that there's 13 backbenchers wanting to contribute to the debate. So in the event that Mr Benn takes 20 minutes in his speech, everyone would have 3 minutes. In the event that he took 10 minutes, everyone would have 4 minutes. But he is free to take whatever time he likes, and then I will divide the remaining time equally between the people, and obviously interventions will take time, but they won't give you more time. So we're clear about what's happening here. And order. So can I invite Hilary Benn to move the motion? Thank you.
Well, I beg to move that the House has considered the matter of leaseholders and cladding. Can I say what a great pleasure it is to serve under your chairship, Mr Davies. I'm grateful to all colleagues who've come along here today. I know a number will want to intervene, but the more interventions, the slightly longer I will take to complete my argument, which I'm very keen the Minister has a chance to hear. And I think the turnout tells the Minister about the strength of feeling on this issue. And it's not very difficult to understand why there are strong feelings. If you just imagine for a moment, you've saved up all your money, you've bought your first flat, it's the home of your dreams, you move in, the future beckons, and then one day a letter drops on the mat. And it's from your managing agent, and it tells you your home is actually in a building that has now been judged a fire risk because of unsafe cladding, and that as a leaseholder, you must immediately, that day, start paying for a waking watch, otherwise all of you are going to have to move out of your homes. In one case in Leeds currently, that waking watch is costing each flat owner £670 a month plus VAT on top of their mortgage and their service charge. You're then probably asked to meet the cost of putting in a fire alarm system, which may or may not reduce the cost of the waking watch, and then you learn to your absolute horror that you are going to be asked to pay for the cost of replacing the dangerous cladding to make your building, your home, safe. Now, the problem is pretty obvious to all of us. You simply don't have that kind of money. Your home has been rendered completely worthless, and therefore you cannot remortgage. Your insurance premium, in all likelihood, is going up, and you worry about possibly being made bankrupt because of all of the cost, which could result, depending on what job you do, in you losing your job as well as your home. And yet none of this is in any way the fault or the responsibility or the doing of the leaseholders themselves. Well, I will give way to my right honourable friend from Tottenham first.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend from Leeds. I've got a building in the Tottenham Hale village of 432 people who cannot get a mortgage or remortgage. Is it his view that this is entirely unacceptable because fire regulations and building regulations are rightly a responsibility of the government, and it's the government that should step in to support these individuals?
Well, that is indeed absolutely my view, and my right honourable friend anticipates what I'm about to come on and say, but of course I will give way.
I congratulate my right honourable friend for securing this immensely important debate on leaseholders and cladding. And will you agree with me that whilst the government's recent announcement of the ACM cladding fund is welcome news, but that does nothing to help those blocks, such as within my own Slough constituency of Lexington and Rivington apartment blocks, where they have non-ACM dangerous cladding, or they are plagued by other fire safety defects, such as a lack of effective fire breaks. So does he agree with me that it's distressing to see that those residents, worried about their financial and safety security, are now suffering sleepless nights, are fearing bankruptcy and homelessness, and that the government needs to help them out?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely correct, and there is a fundamental unfairness in the treatment of different types of leaseholders, and that is the argument that I'm going to put this afternoon. As we've just heard from two colleagues, this is a problem facing a growing number of our constituents. In my case, leaseholders from St George's Building, a number of blocks in Leeds Dock and Timblebeck, who have other types of dangerous cladding. And I want to pay tribute to the Leeds Cladding Scandal Group, to all of the other groups that have been organised up and down the country, and also to the very aptly named Manchester Gladiators, who really have got organised. And I think the name tells us how determined they are to win. I think my honourable friend wants to intervene, of course.
On that point, thank you so much for securing this debate and for mentioning the Manchester Gladiators, who are a network of dozens of blocks in my constituency affected by these issues. But does he agree with them that what they really want now is an ongoing dialogue with the government, where they are at the heart of that dialogue to resolve these issues, because the passing of the buck between freeholders, insurers, the government, that period now has to stop?
I agree with my honourable friend completely, and I hope that today is part of the dialogue, which has already begun, but leaseholders want to feel that they're being listened to. They want to be able to meet ministers, and I hope that today's debate will ensure that more of that happens. Because, as we've already heard, of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for giving away again, but I think it's very powerful to hear how this issue is affecting people's rights across the country, including Radnor House in my constituency of Croydon North, which is in South London, where leaseholders are living in a block converted from offices that has wooden cladding placed on it, so they don't come under the ACM fund the government's opened. But they are also facing massive bills that they cannot afford in homes that they cannot sell, and they have been left in a position where it feels to them the government is penalising innocent leaseholders instead of stepping in with real help, and that is what they need to see.
Yeah.
Well, my honourable friend has painted a picture that we all can do of the strain and the heartache and the worry, and it's not very difficult to understand, because if we'd received one of those letters and it was happening to us in our home, we'd be worried sick too. And what our constituents who are caught up in this nightmare want is our help, and they need it now. Now, the Minister knows only too well how we got here following the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower, so I do not propose to go over any of that again, because the government had to act in the wake of that tragedy to change what was clearly a wholly defective system. But having done so, ministers have put leaseholders in a manifestly unjust position. And if that wasn't bad enough, as more and more building surveys have been done, other problems have come to light, like, for example, missing fire breaks, which means that the buildings were never built according to the building regulations in the first place, or they have wooden balconies that the new guidance says have to be replaced. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm grateful for him giving way on that specific point. I have 1,087 developments in the Pulse development in Colindale. And a lot of those people bought those properties after the building regulations were signed off by the local authority, and that was as recently as 2017. Those people have not been protected by building regulations, have now, as you say, find themselves in a situation where they simply cannot afford to either remortgage or even to sell their property, and they are in redundant properties. So that is a concern, that the assurances from building regulations simply weren't worth the paper they are printed on.
Well, I think the honourable member makes a really important point, because lots of my constituents said to me, but it was signed off by under building regs. Surely it means it's safe. Well, it doesn't quite mean that, for reasons that we could go into on another occasion, but it's part of the system that has still to be fixed. And of course, then there are other leaseholders who've been drawn in, because even though their blocks have not been identified as having a problem, when they try and sell the flat, the mortgage company says, okay, but by the way, where's the certificate that says that this building now complies with the new regulations, quite properly the government's put in place? And if they can't produce it, the property is worthless and it becomes unsellable. And then, if that wasn't complicated enough, just to complete the story, the ownership structure of blocks and the history varies. The developers may have gone bust, the builders may no longer be trading, and some freeholders say, terribly sorry, but I don't have the money to replace the cladding on this building. I will give way.
I do draw the House's attention to my registered member's interest. It's not simply, I think, that the freeholders say, I don't have the money. They don't have the obligation. Most freeholders do not have an obligation to maintain or mitigate any of these problems. The only people that do, perhaps are the original developer, who may not be there, as he says, or the leaseholders. Isn't that the problem? And as he quite rightly says, leaseholders, in many cases, have no means to pay for this remedial work.
Well, the honourable member, who has great expertise in this matter, is correct. And I shall come on to what the government has said up until now about the responsibility of freeholders. But I think at the point that we're all making is this is not the fault of the leaseholders. And they never expected that this might fall upon them when they bought that first dream home. I will give way to my honourable friend, and then I'm going to make progress.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Like his constituency, I have a lot of high-rise blocks, in fact, among the highest number in the country. And one of the major issues now is about getting the government to agree to finance the work that needs to be done ahead of any further tragedies and fatalities. And ahead of the budget statement, does he agree with me that after 2 years of this appalling, horrific tragedy of Grenfell, the government needs to step up and create a fund so that the works could be done, and then the government should go after the freeholders and make them pay where they're able to pay, not our constituents. And that should be our focus. That should be our priority. And we have been saying this time and again in the last Parliament, and I hope that we don't have to keep doing this, and that the government heeds our advice and makes sure that the Chancellor puts some money in the budget in March.
Well, I do agree with my honourable friend, because when the problem of ACM cladding was first identified, the government quite properly said it's all got to come off and be replaced. But they also said something really, really important. They said, however that was done, leaseholders should not have to pay. This is what the then Secretary of State said on the 29th of November 2018. Everyone has a right to feel safe in their homes, and I've repeatedly made clear that building owners and developers must replace dangerous ACM cladding, and the costs must not be passed on to leaseholders. I agree with that. It was a point the Secretary of State repeated on the 9th of May 2019 when he said, leaseholders find themselves in this position through no fault of their own, and this is not morally defensible. Again, I agree. It would be monstrous to accept people who are entirely blameless to pay for the mistakes and errors and others. And it's been pointed out, if our constituents had bought cars or washing machines that were a fire risk, no one would dream of saying to them, sorry, you're going to have to pay for the cost of replacement. Their problem is they bought the home of their dreams. And I want to acknowledge the responsible way in which some freeholders have, including in Leeds, have accepted they need to foot the bill to replace the cladding. The work's either been done, in progress, or we're told it's timetabled. But despite the government's policy, there have been freeholders who haven't lived up to their responsibilities. And that's why the government eventually realised it couldn't carry on, because otherwise ACM cladding wouldn't be removed. And that's why on the 9th of May last year, they announced the £200 million fund to help support the removal of ACM to protect those leaseholders from bearing the cost. Now, there have been problems with the fund. Again, another debate, slow disbursement, bureaucracy and the like. But I welcome that decision because it showed unreservedly that the government was determined to uphold the principle it had established, namely that leaseholders should not have to pay. But what's happening at the moment in respect of buildings with other types of unsafe cladding completely contradicts that principled position that the government, up until this point, has taken. Now, why is this? Now, first of all, the Secretary of State, on the, I think, of the 20th of January, said, well, the advice I've got is that ACM cladding is much more dangerous than other types, although anyone who's looked at the film of the student accommodation in Bolton going up, convulsed in flames, might wonder, it was covered in HPL, by the way, whether that is the case. And it was the government's review that brought in the new advice, that toughened the standards, that led to other buildings to be peered at and prodded and bits taken off, and people discovered the problems with HPL and other systems. And the truth is, nobody knows how many such buildings there may be. But the point is that the leaseholders in these buildings with other types of cladding find themselves in exactly the same position as people who are living in buildings with ACM cladding, except for one thing. The government's fund doesn't cover the removal of their cladding. Secondly, this idea of differential risk, frankly, is not applied by the West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service, because they do not distinguish between different types of cladding when they issue notices to say, this building's unsafe, waking watch now, or you're all going to have to move out, give us a plan to show how you're going to replace it. The Chief Fire Officer of West Yorkshire put it to me this week on Monday, and I quote, "It is our view that there is no difference between unsafe ACM cladding and unsafe HPL cladding. So why is the government seeking to distinguish between the two when it comes to the position of leaseholders? And I say to the Minister, I think that position is completely unsustainable. Thirdly, ministers have rightly been adamant unsafe cladding's got to be removed. And they set up the fund. And they've said they're going to name and shame freeholders who don't get on and do it. And the latest building safety data release says that there are still 174 private sector residential buildings that are yet to be remediated, ACM-clad buildings. But what's their position on other types of dangerously clad buildings? Are the owners of those blocks going to be named and shamed? And if not, why not? Now, when the Secretary of State was pressed on this point on the 20th in the House, he indicated the government was considering further help. And in answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Hackney South and Shoreditch, he talked about the possibility of loans. Now, if the loans went to the freeholders, then that might possibly be a way forward, but only provided the government could guarantee that none of the costs would then be passed on to the leaseholders. Because if they just get a bill for it through their service charge, it's going to breach the principle that the government set. But it was actually clear from the Secretary of State's reply to my right honourable friend that he was talking about loans to leaseholders, because he referred to existing examples of building owners who provided low or zero interest loans on a hardship basis, and went on to say, and I quote, "There may be a role for the government in ensuring that works, that the loans are affordable, and that it is done as quickly as possible." But this would be another change of policy, because on the 9th of May last year, when the then Secretary of State announced the grant fund, he was specifically asked about loans, and he said this, and I quote, "We looked at the questions, such as whether a loan arrangement could work, but ultimately, given the complexity of the time that would be involved and the need for all sorts of different consents, and given that my priority is providing a sense of assurance for leaseholders and getting on with this, we decided to adopt this structure," end of quote, i.e. grants. If that was the view then, what's changed? Perhaps the Minister could explain in response. And when the Secretary of State talked about hardship, where leaseholders are on low incomes or don't have any savings, the implication of that is very clearly, if you don't fall into one of those two categories, you're going to bear the total cost yourself. And the problem with the idea of loans is that it completely breaches the principle that the government set out at the start of this crisis. And believe you me, it is a crisis. Namely that leaseholders living in buildings with unsafe cladding should not have to pay for the cost of its removal, because it would mean we'd end up with two classes of leaseholder, one of which the government was seeking to protect from the cost of replacing cladding, and the other that the government is saying, "I'm terribly sorry, you've got to pay." And I think that would be completely unfair. And that's why many of us, and we've heard the calls already today, are calling on ministers, as am I, to extend the coverage and size of the fund to all buildings with unsafe cladding of whatever type, because I think it's the only fair way forward and the only way that the objective of removing all dangerous cladding with which we all agree can be achieved. I will give way in just 1 second, because unless that happens, where freeholders can't find the money or don't, where leaseholders clearly don't have the money, then the nightmare continues. And they'll go on living in an unsafe building where the only way they can stay is to go on and on and on paying for a waking watch, because the cladding will never be removed because there's no one to pay for it. Yeah. And eventually that will bankrupt them. I give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, and I thank him for the case that he's set out. Residents of the Lumiere building in Manor Park in my constituency tell me that there is ACM cladding on the front side of the building and other kinds of dangerous cladding on the other three sides. Doesn't it seem particularly absurd that government funding can help with one part of the building but not the rest of it?
I think my right honourable friend makes an overwhelmingly powerful case for treating all unsafe cladding as unsafe that needs to be replaced. Now, we know, and the Minister's got a tough job because negotiations with the Treasury are a difficult thing. And we know that there are complications. Was building control at fault originally? Can freeholders claim on insurance or building warranties? Can they sue the architects or the developers for defects in the original design or construction, assuming there's someone still left to sue? Well, maybe, but that's going to take years. And it's not an answer, although I would readily say, If a claim is successful and the government's paid to remove the cladding, the money ought to go back to the government. And I'd also say I'd have no problem with the government taking equity in the freehold of buildings if they've coughed up to pay for the removal of the cladding. And what more, by the way, can the government do on this problem of buildings not yet identified as unsafe where mortgage companies are asking for that certificate? Because although there's been the EWS1 form, it appears it hasn't solved all of the problems, and it would be very good to hear from the Minister what more could be done. Mr Davies, I want to bring my remarks to a close, because there are many colleagues who want to speak. I just want to say this. I can see no case for ministers moving away from the principle they established at the start of this crisis, that leaseholders should not have to pay. I can see no case for treating one group of leaseholders differently from another. I can see no other way in which all of this dangerous cladding is going to be replaced unless the government steps in and extends the coverage of its fund to all types of blocks, which the fire service has identified are unsafe. That's what's needed, and it's needed urgently. And all of the leaseholders on whose behalf we are speaking today, all of us, whose lives are in turmoil, will be watching very, very, very carefully what the Minister has to say in response. They're not going anywhere. Indeed, they can't go anywhere because they're trapped in their homes. And all they're asking for is to be able to put this nightmare behind them, to go back to living in a safe home, and to get on with their lives. And every single one of us in this chamber has a responsibility to make sure that that's what happens, and happens soon.
And that will be described in 3 minutes by Sir Robert Neal.
Mr Davies, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I congratulate the right honourable gentleman upon securing this debate. I very much agree with the thrust of what he has said. The residents of North Point in Bromley, in my constituency, find themselves in a very similar position. They are caught in this situation. They have ACM cladding, but like many blocks, it's actually a combination of cladding that is used within the system. So they have HCM, but they also have HPL cladding as well. They need clarity that all the remediation and removal costs will be met. Secondly, the process is proving, whatever the good intentions of government, and I accept they were good, to be continuingly costly and bureaucratic from them. There are still delays, and this is many months now since that they were told that they had this problem, but they have still not been able to access the fund. They're having to fork out for surveys, but these are people whose flats are valueless anyway, because they cannot raise any further equity against it, because there is no equity anymore. They can't remortgage, they can't raise any other kind of loan against them. They have flats which are effectively valueless, but at the same time they are obliged to fork out for the costs of a waking watch. In their case, they have so far, in terms of by requirements of the fire brigade, waking watch and fire alarm system, had to fork out nearly £120,000 between the residents of this block of flats, which they have to find other than from the equity of their properties. It's putting people under massive, massive strain. People's health is being affected in consequence. They're paying £11,000 a month now, with no sight of that ending, and that's the other point. Because it is taking so long to get any clarity as to whether they qualify, I hope to God they will, and we'd have thought, on the face of it, stone bonk they should, but it's taking so long. Every month is another £11,000. So speeding up the process, making sure that the inevitable costs of waking watch and alarms are also met, because these flow directly from the unsafeness of the cladding. They wouldn't be doing that otherwise. Thirdly, making sure that all systems which involve dangerous cladding, be it ACM or HMPL, are clearly and manifestly brought within the scope of the scheme is essential. And I hope, too, we'll look at the position around insurance, because they, too, are seeing their premiums increase massively. It has to be surely done by way of grant. Loan does not seem appropriate, and of course in many cases the freeholders would be have a legal entitlement in their freehold agreements with the leaseholders to recover costs from the leaseholders. So you have to get the grant to the freeholders to be sure that they are not the people out of pocket. On any view, they are the innocent victims in this. I know the Minister understands the complexity of this. I know that the government wants to do the right thing. Previous Secretaries of State were very clear about this, but there is a real risk that the the good intentions that were set out at the beginning of this are getting lost in a mire of bureaucracy. And I really hope that the Minister can give us reassurance on those specific points I've raised, and also on how we could cut through this and speed up the process.
Thank you very much for your brevity. 3 minutes, as I say, is being imposed. I call Matthew Pennycook next.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my right honourable friend for securing this important debate and giving such a comprehensive overview of the problem. In my constituency alone, there are more than 20 privately owned buildings across 7 developments which were found to have ACM cladding. And far from meeting the government's target of remediating them all by June of this year, work has completed on only one, Babbage Point. And while it's well underway at 2 other sites, New Capitol Quay and Greenwich Square, it has not even begun on the remaining 4, not least because of difficulties around the application process for the private sector remediation fund. When it comes to cost, in 2 cases, that of City Peninsula and the Greenwich Millennium Village, the developers have done the right thing and committed to covering the full costs of the remedial works and the required interim fire safety measures. In the case of New Capitol Quay, leaseholders are being fully protected from those costs because the NHBC accepted a claim to pay in full following an investigation. But others in other blocks have not been so fortunate. At Babbage Point, the original contractor and building owner, Durkan, has strenuously avoided committing to covering the costs of the completed remedial works should their application to the fund be unsuccessful, and they've passed on the full costs of 23 months of waking watch in place for so long because they themselves dragged their feet. Of course, as we've already heard, the cladding crisis now extends far beyond the issue of ACM. My local authority has identified at least 24 buildings and counting with a type of HPL present, where leaseholders are likely to find themselves in protracted legal disputes between building owners and the original contractor. There are an unknown number of buildings that have serious issues with defective fire stopping and compartmentalisation, as the Barratt-constructed Royal Artillery Quays development in my constituency does, where again leaseholders are at risk of being hit with significant costs. And there are an untold number of leaseholders in scores of developments locally who currently cannot sell their homes or remortgage because of the unintended impact of MHCLG guidance. And the Minister should know that in some cases, while the ESW1 process has worked, in many others it hasn't. And I have cases where large mortgage providers are rejecting the form outright, and others where forms can't even be issued because of a lack of indemnity insurance coverage. It's clear the steps taken to date have not even begun to address this set of interconnected problems. And while it's perhaps understandable that ministers and their officials might be overwhelmed by a crisis which continues to grow in its scale and complexity, and balk at the potentially colossal drain on the public purse, this crisis is not going to disappear. As we've said time and time again, the government have a responsibility to act decisively to fix it. Ministers need to start by going beyond the moral suasion and compelling developers to do the right thing. Where that won't work, step in and expand the scope and the amount of funding to remediate where necessary, and oversee a nationally coordinated response to this, so that 3 years, coming up to 3 years from the Grenfell tragedy, we can finally get a grip on this and protect leaseholders as they were promised in the wake of that tragedy.
Thank you. Now I call Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak at this date. I draw members' attention to my register of interests. I have individuals in my constituency who have apartments and houses with cladding problems, some of which is ACM and some of which is not. I personally live in one which has the ACM problem, so I'm actually quite close to the whole issue. I think the problem has been well articulated, and I totally agree with the comments and the explanation, which is very clear. Perhaps, therefore, in my 2.5 minutes, I might just turn to some of the things that could and should be done differently. First, clearly, it's not just ACM cladding. The government needs to redefine what is covered. It needs to be everything which is going to make that building a fire risk too. The size of the pot is too small. I can assure the Minister of that from my own personal experience. The portal, from personal experience, is impossible to use, and unless you've got some experts in IT and surveying within your leasehold community, you'll find that almost impossible. The government, at one level, expects exhaustion of all other legal recourse. Frankly, that's expensive, timely. Most leaseholders have neither the pocket nor the ability. The government ought to take over those claims, effectively giving the money, but then taking over the right to those claims against anyone who they think they can make a claim against. The government has appointed a regulator, brilliant, but we don't have the regulations. So we are in a position of trying to comply with regulations, but we don't know what they are. That needs to be expedited. The timeline for the work to be done is far too short, and I can, again, record that from personal experience. The block I'm most familiar with has come to phase 2. We are being required to give collateral warranties. While warranties are very standard, these warranties are being given in favour of the government, not in favour of the leasehold owners, which seems to me mad. Are the government looking to take a lien on the property? And such warranties are normally underpinned by insurance, but no insurance company will touch those with a barge pole. So the government needs to step in with some insurance solution if it actually wants this to work. The state aid forms, which have been referred to, are very difficult, very complex, and they need to be addressed. I think to expect every building to have every leasehold owner complete one is completely unrealistic. The government should step in with the banks, and particularly where those with existing mortgages, where the banks are saying, we will not allow you to borrow more even at the same rate for this work, even though it's my security, which is effectively, as in the bank security, which is being affected, makes no sense. Require the banks to lend the money, at the very least as a starter, to those who already have mortgages. Likewise with insurers who won't insure anything to do with cladding. The government must step in and make clear that cannot be a valid exception or exclusion. VAT. There's no point, frankly, charging VAT and then the government effectively paying it out again. Take VAT off this. Remember that the suppliers in this market are now growing in number, and that's putting prices up. That also needs to be fixed. I end my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. May I invite Meg Hillier to make your contribution.
Thank you very much,
Meg.
Mr Davies, and a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, whose remarks summarise a lot of what I think we would all have said if I hadn't been able to cover it so thoroughly. So I want to focus on the costs to individuals and, of course, ultimately to the taxpayer if government does have a bailout, and also to highlight the impact on many of my constituents. And it's fair to say that after the Grenfell fire, Hackney was relatively unscathed despite a large number of tower blocks, because ACM was affecting a few blocks but not many. But it is the new changes and rules that have affected so many of my constituents. I should, of course, declare, Mr Davies, an interest. I am a leaseholder myself. I'm having all my cladding removed. My developer is footing the entire bill. But no doubt my property is worth nothing at the moment. But it's not for myself, I argue, but for the many, many of my constituents who are not in as fortunate a position as me. So the costs that mount up. The costs for the surveys to the property. So, for example, for Hackney Council alone, they've been given £88,000 for data collection. That's got to cover 200 and more council blocks. That is way too inadequate. But there are costs of surveys for all owners of buildings. That often also falls on the leaseholders. There's the cost of remedial work. Some of that needs to be happening immediately. For example, new fire alarms in individual flats and in corridors. That is work that has to happen before Waking Watch can even be considered being removed. We've heard about the costs of Waking Watch. There's the hugely increased mortgage costs, and I've got one constituent who tells me I can neither remortgage or sell my flat. I'm currently stuck paying a variable rate mortgage, and I'm paying £800 more a month than necessary. That's on top of any other costs around Waking Watch and so on. Insurance costs have gone up for blocks around the country, and the excellent group, all-party parliamentary group on leasehold reform, heard about this only a few weeks ago, and that is not something that looks like it's going down. It's something the Minister needs to look at. Yeah. Insurance companies just can't get away with this, because the reality of the risk is probably not as high as their algorithm throws up, but it's punitive on the residents. And shared owners, of course, are paying the whole cost of the building, not just the bit that they own, but the whole rental. So it's a problem partly with the shared ownership model. And there are challenges, we know, in tracking down owners, the shortage of skills for surveys and remedial work. So this is an issue that perhaps the Minister could look at. Has the Migration Advisory Committee looked at the skills that are needed and whether they could be urgently rushed through so more people could be available to speed up this, which is being done obviously on a riskier buildings first basis. And then, of course, the inability to get the paperwork is absolutely critical. Some of these properties could get mortgages, but without the right certificate, they can't, as my right honourable friend highlighted. We have too many mortgage prisoners. And the Minister, the Secretary of State, previous Secretary of State, made a bold decision with the ministerial direction to set up the fund to deal with ACM cladding. The government needs to be equally bold, and if it is looking at loans, it must not make sure that bad developers don't get away with it. It must make sure that loans are to the developer rather than to the owner, because a loan increases the lack of mortgageability. But that certificate of safety would help a lot of my constituents right here, right now. And if the Minister could do anything to reassure us on that one issue alone today, that would help a lot of people right now, while we recognise there are bigger challenges ahead.
Thank you. Tom Hunt.
And thank you for the Honourable Member for Leeds Central for being such a powerful advocate today for many of my constituents. You said exactly what they feel and exactly what I feel. One of the first surgeries I ever held as a newly elected Member of Parliament was with some of the individuals who have been impacted by this. They feel that their lives have been destroyed by it, and I would like the government to know and to be absolutely aware that I will not hold back in doing absolutely everything I can to fight for them. I will be a lion and fighting for their interests, and I will not stop until their interests are looked after. So I want to echo some of the points. I think most of the speakers can agree on two key points. The first thing is to go after the freeholders and not the leaseholders. In this case, actually, the freeholder of this flat block in Ipswich, St Francis Tower, 116 flats, 17 stories. The freeholder who put in the cladding in question was a different freeholder than the current freeholder. Essentially, this is HPL cladding, it's not ACM, and my constituents cannot understand. They cannot understand why a type of cladding, which has been, after an inquiry, was said to pose an intolerable risk to life, is being treated in a different way than the ACM cladding either. Yes. Yeah.
I congratulate him on his passion for his constituents. Constituents of mine own a property, a leasehold property in that block in Ipswich. Isn't the incredible thing that the cladding he's referring to has a far stronger, is far more dangerous than the cladding used on the Grenfell Tower?
Absolutely, I can completely agree with the Honourable Member for South Suffolk. So essentially, the communication has been pretty poor as well. So the block management company who are responsible for the block, the communication to my constituents has almost inflamed their anxieties and tensions. They're receiving letters saying that they're required to pay between £21,000 and £24,000. The cost of their properties has collapsed as a result of this. It's now got to a stage where the amount they're being asked to pay is about a third of the cost of the entire property. This is hanging over them, and as the Honourable Member for Leeds Central said, they feel trapped. So, in conclusion to my remarks, I would ask the Honourable Member, I'd ask the government to appreciate the position that my constituents feel like they're in. This impacts over 100 of my constituents in that block, but perhaps there are others. And to take steps and to make sure that the £200 million fund that was set up to support those who live in flats where the cladding was ACM is extended to provide support for my constituents. The cladding has exactly the same impact, and there is absolutely no logical reason why they should be treated in any different way than those who live in properties where the cladding is ACM. So the key principles I'd like to press forward, which are the points made by the Honourable Member for Leeds Central, are to go after the freeholders, not the leaseholders, and for there to be fairness in the way in which these individuals are treated. So I would beg the government to stand up for my constituents in a way that the Honourable Member for Leeds Central has, and hopefully I have as well in this place today. Thank you very much.
Very much. May I now invite Lynn Brown.
Mr Davis, absolutely pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. This is an extraordinary issue that's causing terrible problems to many members of my constituency. I'm only sorry that I'm not going to have the time to do their cases justice. I'm currently dealing with 31 separate cases and counting, and in just one of those cases, it involves representing 57 different constituents in a single block. One local housing provider has told residents they will be funding just 20 fire risk assessments a year in an area where they have over 100 properties. And when I say 100 properties, I don't mean 100 flats, I mean 100 blocks. In so many cases, my constituents have been left trapped and powerless. Many don't know if their homes are safe. Many have been unable to sell or remortgage. Massively expensive retrofitting is often necessary, but isn't being carried out. One constituent is living with his young daughter in a one-bed flat. He can't sell or move somewhere more suitable because there isn't yet a cladding report. Another split with his partner and can't remortgage to make good that separation. The current mortgage has expired, trapping the couple on a higher rate, costing an exorbitant extra £450 a month. it's causing severe financial and emotional strain. Another constituent was told it could take 5 years to provide the cladding report. Something is so desperately and fundamentally wrong with the whole legal structure around this issue, and it's our job in this place to put that right. Today hasn't been long enough, a speech to do my constituents' cases justice, and I hope they'll forgive me. But can I say to the Minister, she can see how many of us are in this room. She knows the issues, right? Can she not make some time available for us to be able to debate this in a full-time debate on the floor of the House? And finally, I've talked about all the problems with the practicalities of this. But my constituents are living with the knowledge that the place that they're trapped in, the place that's costing them a fortune, might be a death trap. And as a child who grew up in the shadow of Ronan Point in a flat, I know how this impacts upon families. I know what that fear does. So I want to hear from the Minister today that the government will intervene and will do so strongly to exorcise the spectre of the tragedy of Grenfell that is constantly hanging over my constituents' lives. Thank you.
Shabana Mahmood.
To serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, for securing this debate, and I associate myself with all of the very powerful arguments that he made on behalf of his and indeed all of our constituents this afternoon. Mr Davies, I represent many hundreds of people affected by these issues, including in the Islington Gates development in the Jewellery Quarter area of my constituency, which is a 144-unit development where they've already been carrying out remedial work to their building. They're paying for a waking watch, lighting upgrades, and at the moment they're carrying out structural fire resilience work, including around fire compartmentalisation. That work is estimated to come in at a total of £1.5 million. That's about £5,000 per leaseholder in that building, and that's before they get to the cladding removal. They are trapped in the same problem that many of our constituents have. They have non-ACM cladding, but it is just as, if not more dangerous than the ACM cladding, which is qualified for relief from the government. The bill for the removal of ACM cladding looks as if it's going to come in at about £5 to £6 million. So each leaseholder is facing a bill of about £40,000 to £50,000. And I want to come on to this point about insurance, because the premium for that building in the previous year was £36,000. But when they came to renew, they found that their insurer would not renew their building on their own. So they had to go through a broker, and a huge amount of stress and trouble and difficulty to find a consortium of 5 insurers who will share the risk of insuring their building, and that premium has now come in at £190,000. That is a 5-fold increase, and they seem to have received no credit for the fact that they've carried out a huge amount of remedial work already. So it doesn't matter what you do, actually the insurance company are running scared of many of our constituents trapped in buildings like this. But this is something on which the government can take action. It takes action in areas which are affected by flooding, for example, and we have the good example already of the flood race scheme. It should stand behind our leasehold constituents and force the insurance company to act. It is unconscionable that these buildings may, in the end, be uninsurable without government action. Our constituents are hit with a multiple whammy where tens of thousands of flat dwellers are uninsured, unable to sell or remortgage, and unable to find the money to put their unsafe buildings right. And this has a huge impact on people. I just want to quote from an email I had from one of my constituents. He tells me, estimates are very loose at the moment, but it is likely that I will have to pay in the region of £80,000 to £100,000. I can't sleep, function or work. I try to be normal with my son, but I can't. I have a constant gut-wrenching dread coursing through my bloodstream. Each and every second, I want to cry. These are real people with real lives affected by a national calamity. It is morally imperative on the government to finally step up to the plate and act.
Thank you. Now I invite Derek Twigg.
I'd just like to congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, for securing this debate and his excellent speech as well. I don't intend to go over any of the points he made, but I really do want to bring some details to the attention of the Minister of how this is affecting my constituents, because this isn't just an issue that affects the cities, it also affects our towns, such as Runcorn in my constituency. I want to talk particularly about the developments called the DEX development, consisting of 6 individual blocks of flats. The DEX were built in 2007. 3 blocks are 7-storey and 3 blocks are 6-storey. Therefore, they do not meet the definition of high-rise premises. They're cladded.
in high-pressure laminate HPL. Now, what I'd like the Minister to understand is that's how this has affected my constituents. On a building survey, the building survey identified the following, that sections of the external walls of each building are fitted with cladding which will support fire spread. There are cavities behind the cladding systems that do not have the required cavity barriers or fire stopping to prevent vertical and horizontal fire spread. The structural timber frame is exposed within the external wall cavities. The external wall cavity is open to the ground floor car parking, permitting the fire spread to be in the case of a car fire. Now, the specific fire safety concerns that were raised is there's a risk of rapid fire spread over the external cladding of each building. There is a risk of rapid fire spread through the cavities behind the cladding. There's a risk of fire spread from the car parks to the cladding system and the cavities. The car park, of course, cannot be used, so people cannot park the cars. There is a risk of early structural collapse if the supporting timber frame, as I referred to just a minute ago, is affected by fire. And there is a risk that the escape routes could be compromised. Now, this is a massive human cost and nightmare and stress for those people living in this. Many of my constituents are in negative equity. The 266 homes are unsellable and not rentable. Constituents have been advised it will cost them around £30,000 per household to remedy the issue. They do not have that sort of money. They are worried that they will become bankrupt by this, lose their homes and become homeless. And it's through no fault of their own at all. And they bought their homes in good faith and, of course, the regulations that are applied at that particular point in time. Now, I do believe it is important that the government really does tackle this, and it can only do that by setting up a fund to make these buildings safe and comply with the regulations now. Leaseholders are not to blame and should not bear the cost. My constituents should not be treated differently just because the cladding's HPL.
Right, Florence Ashimoli. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Davis, and to thank the member for Leeds for securing this really important debate which affects a number of our constituents right across the country. In my short time as the MP for Vauxhall, I've been made acutely aware of how big a problem this is for leaseholders in privately rented and owned buildings. In just a couple of months, I've had so many cases brought to my attention from constituents who've been unable to sell, who've been unable to remortgage, and a number of them who have been unable to get the safety certificates which they really need from their freeholders. And they're having to pay for this through really expensive service charges. The scenario for a number of these leaseholders is that they feel trapped in their homes, unable to move, while facing that constant fear that your house, where you live, your home, may catch fire. How can anybody sleep at night knowing that risk lies over your head? None of us could. And we are coming up to nearly 3 years since the Grenfell disaster, which alerted the whole country to the dangers of combustible cladding, and almost a year and a half since the government banned ACM cladding on new high-rise. So let's make no mistake that actually there's been plenty of time to make a remediation so that we can see these plans put in place and to remove that combustible cladding. I think it's right that the government have placed and opened that £200 million fund for private sector blocks to remove the cladding. But however, to date, out of the 56 tower blocks in London, which fall within the scope of that funding, only 10 have submitted plans to get the initial costs covered, and none of those have submitted full cost plans. So this fund isn't working. As a result, no money has been distributed to any of the building scopes in London, nearly a year after this scheme has started. We really need the government to take urgent action to fix this funding system. And I think there's lots of things that the government can be doing and should be doing now to help make this system fairer. It could provide technical support for a number of block owners who are not used to dealing with large remediation projects. They're not building technicians, they're not surveyors. They are residents living in their homes. Why are they having to deal with this? And we could also look at how do we help people who are struggling to get those, some of those complex applications off the ground. I think ultimately, if the government has no trust in the private sector to make the leaseholders feel safe in their properties, then they need to give the local authority the plans and the powers to confiscate these blocks and carry out those works themselves. So I hope that the Minister will agree with me that this isn't a matter of ideology and us making complaints on behalf of our leaseholders. It's about a matter of life and death for a number of our leaseholders. So I urge the government to fund this properly.
Thank you very much. Justin Madders. Thank you.
under your chairmanship, and can I also congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, for securing this debate, and I pay tribute to the work that he's done so far. Put on the record my co-chairmanship of the APPG on Common Hold and Leasehold, as well as being a patron of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who bring their expertise to the APPG and the many people who've been left high and dry as a result of this scandal. Indeed, I wonder where people would have been, who they would have turned to if the LKP partnership had not been there. And they've heard, as we've heard from many leaseholders up and down the country, being placed in an impossible position, unable to pay for remedial works, unable to obtain finance for it, and unable to sell their home until the work is done. They have been left stranded, effectively abandoned. And whilst this may be a technical and at times slightly legalistic debate, at the heart of it are people like the ones we've heard about today, who are looking for a bit of leadership and a bit of hope. And there's clearly a tension between what the government considered to be the moral case for remediation costs not being passed on to leaseholders, and the legal position where freeholders may be entitled to recover costs from the leaseholder. Because although the government's pledges so far have, to a significant extent, removed potential liability for some, there are still costs that can be visited on the leaseholder, not just about ACM cladding. However, as well, we know there is a lack of clarity about other types of cladding, about who is responsible for the many waking watches that have now become necessary, and at the moment some serious doubts about whether the private fund is being utilised properly or at all. Applications continue to be processed, but we don't know how much, if any, of that fund has been spent, and crucially, we do not know what will happen to those sites where no application has been made at all. It should be clear that the longer it takes to resolve these issues, the more innocent leaseholders will have to pay out to fund these waking watches, and that is thousands of pounds that is needlessly spent that they will probably never get back. So statements from ministers are not enough. Talk about morality is not enough. Saying there is a strong expectation on freeholders to put matters right is not enough. There is a lottery at the moment, and depending upon the insurance company, the freeholder, the developer, the terms of the lease, the type of cladding involved, any outcome is possible. And it seems clear to me, I think probably to most people in this room today, that in the absence of somebody stepping forward to put matters right, that if a property was built in accordance with regulations at the time, but is now considered unsafe, then it must be the responsibility, ultimately, of the government. My APPG co-chair, the father of the house, who can't be with us today, unfortunately, joins me in this analysis, and he says, "We've been grateful for the initiative of the Select Committee, and we asked them to hold hearings to hear leaseholders' voices. The Government and Parliament have imminent work to do. That is the way to justice. See the evil, do good, recognise the people," speaking through the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. And I think it is those leaseholders' voices that we do need to hear. And the LKP Partnership have done a recent survey of 117 different sites where people are affected by these issues. And the findings of that are stark. 90% of people surveyed said the government had provided no help at all. Minister, that has to change, and it has to change very soon.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Ruth Cadbury.
Mr Davis, it's a pleasure to serve under you. Time is short, and other members here have covered many of the issues that I wanted to raise, and particularly my right honourable friend from Leeds Central, who covered the overall issues so well. I just want to say a little bit about some examples that I've had. Firstly, a man who came to my surgery who lives in a relatively new block. He's got a job in Scotland and therefore needed to move from West London and wanted to sell his flat, and discovered that the people he was going to sell it to couldn't get a mortgage, and he's been waiting for months, toing and froing between the builders and himself and his solicitors and the mortgage company in order to try and find out why there is a delay, because until he gets this sorted, his life is on hold. It appears that the block is not ACM, but maybe HPL, but he's not getting straight answers. Secondly, the Paragon development, built by Berkeley First and Notting Hill Housing Association jointly some years ago now, was featured in Private Eye. After many years of the residents facing damp, the Notting Hill Genesis opened up the cavities and opened up behind the walls and found a whole range of problems, including lack of horizontal and vertical barriers, as has been mentioned by others here, and particularly cladding problems. What's worse is that the scaffolding went up over a year ago, and work stopped not long afterwards. Two building companies have gone bust.
the residents have been, the leaseholders, their shared owners, have been living with basically their flats exposed to the elements apart from a sheet of wood for months and months, plus the security issues of having scaffolding outside their windows. There are also 700 students living in the other blocks on that estate as well, who also face that fear, given the fire that was that we saw in this student block in Bolton. So, and finally, I've got a large development which was built by a volume house builder, of which 3 or 4 of the blocks were then transferred under a long lease or a head lease to a housing association. It now turns out that the cladding on those blocks is dubious and possibly ACM. But what we're finding is that while the shared owners and, I have to say, the social rent tenants living in those blocks live in fear and uncertainty, there is a continuous passing the buck between the housing association and the developer over whose responsibility is to pay for the problem. So I concur with many of my colleagues here, members here today. The government must take responsibility for actually the problem in the first place, the building regulations and the fire regulations, inadequate despite warnings from previous fires. Think of the residents not only facing the costs and unable to sell and move on, but living in fear that they could be the next victims of the next fire. Thank you.
We've got the wonderful Fleur Anderson. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr Davis, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I do congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, and everyone else who's spoken in this debate from across the country to show the strength of feeling. And I would join in representing many of my constituents who feel just as strongly. They feel that their life is a misery because of this, and this is surely an unforeseen circumstance and result from a fund which is meant to save lives and meant to be a good thing for people across the country, but actually has led to dreadful circumstances for residents. 2 particular buildings in my constituency, to add to those other stories that we've heard today, are leaseholders at the Swish building and the Riverside Quarter, with 66 and 200 flats, respectively. They've been told by their freeholder that the cladding and other fire safety measures in their building, which is either not ACM or it's a mixture between ACM and HPL, does not now meet the standard regarded by the government as adequate for the issuance of a fire safety certificate and needs to be reclad. To their horror, they've been told that they need to foot the bill for this work. They've been told it's tens of thousands of pounds. They haven't been told exactly what it is, but they believe that it's between £50,000 and £80,000 per flat. This raises a few issues. First of all, safety. If the current cladding doesn't meet the safety requirements for a safety certificate, are their blocks safe? And different blocks, as we've heard in this debate today, are being treated very differently. So the fire regulations are not up to scratch. Also, fairness. To make leaseholders foot the bill for this is outrageous. They're not multi-million-pound landlords by any stretch. They're normal people trying to live their lives, and they do not have £50,000 lying around. It's taking a huge emotional toll. I will.
That the cost of leaseholders, which we've all highlighted, is unfair. But does she not also agree that as the taxpayer could ultimately foot this bill, we should also make sure that dodgy developers or developers who won't step up to the mark don't get away with not paying and the taxpayer bailing out people just because they won't pay?
I absolutely agree. So there's got to be a way that the fund can be both easy to use and urgently accessed, that this doesn't hold up the fund for a very, very long time in terms of red tape, but also makes the right people have to foot the bill. And I would argue that the government needs to extend the cladding fund to all types of unsafe cladding, because that's what it's there for. So the emotional toll has been, the net result for me has been to lose my home, as one person has sold it. They can't sell it, they can't raise a mortgage to finance repairs because it's unsellable, and he's unemployed, and therefore he's going to lose his lease. He's going to become homeless as a result of this. Another resident told me that his flat is unsaleable and effectively worthless. They bought their flat in 2004 in good faith, believing it to be a safe home, and the fact that it's now considered to have these problems is not of their making. They can't afford to pay this sum of this size on top of the existing service charge. So in summary, I'm shocked, as everyone else is here today, and I hope that, Minister, that you will be telling us some good news at the end of this, very urgently, that 3 years after Grenfell, my constituents are being asked to fork out huge sums of money for the building which they ultimately don't own as well, and this goes back to the leaseholder crisis. No leaseholder should have to pay for this, and no leaseholder on the way should have this huge stress and uncertainty, and an urgent response is needed. And so I join with others today to ask for the cladding fund to be extended to all forms of unsafe cladding, and for this to be done very urgently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your sort of collective discipline in terms of time management, which gives us just over half an hour for the front benches. So I invite Alison Thewlis to speak on behalf of the SNP.
Thank you very much, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to see you, the Chair. I congratulate you on your expert chairing of this, which has allowed many members to have their say. I will try to limit my comments so that people can intervene on the Minister if required later on. So I approach this debate from a slightly different angle from Scotland, because we don't have the leaseholder-freeholder issue, but we do have continuing issues with cladding, and issues that the UK Government have had an influence on, which the UK Government has not had the best of communication with the Scottish Government on. So the Scottish Government has ended up in a situation where we have a problem that is not of their making, but are struggling in order to put it right, because obviously finance and insurance is reserved to Westminster, and the actions of mortgage companies, banks and insurers is something that we have limited influence on from the Scottish Government point of view. So I want to turn first to the issue raised around Advice Note 14, which pertained to fire safety in buildings post-Grenfell. And this was brought in with very limited consultation with the Scottish Government, which means that as a result, mortgage lenders are now insisting that properties over 18 metres in height with cladding provide specific documentation evidencing how well they comply with safety standards. And most properties in Scotland, because that have been built in the last 5 years, comply with specific safety standards set out by the Scottish Government, and our fire standards and building regs are better and more comprehensive than those in England. So we don't have the same scale of the problem that honourable members have identified today. But without the requisite certification, they can't meet these new standards now being imposed by lenders. So as a result, surveyors who are instructed to compile home reports, which is the way which this is done in Scotland, which is a routine exercise when properties are being sold or remortgaged, have then found that they've been imposed with nil valuations. And constituents across the country, including many in my constituency of Glasgow Central, have spoken in similar terms to the honourable members here today about not being able to sell their properties or be able to remortgage, and as a result of this. And in some cases, as honourable members have mentioned in their own constituencies, that house sales have fallen through, leaving residents out of pocket. And similar to the honourable member who mentioned that somebody couldn't take up a job, and the member for Brentford and Isleworth, this was brought to my attention by somebody who had arranged to move to Poland with his Polish wife, and their house sale fell through at the last minute. So all their stuff, all their arrangements had been made to move to Poland, and they now can't sell their home, and they are stuck. And despite the vast majority of properties being certified by council building control departments, many surveyors are refusing to commit to evaluation without seeing specific certification about the cladding. So in response, the Scottish Government has written to MHCLG 4 times, the 18th of October, the 8th of November, the 19th of December, and again on the 27th of January. And as far as I am aware, Mr Davies, this correspondence has not yet been formally responded to, which is completely unacceptable. And I would ask the Minister to take this on if she can. And the correspondence from the Scottish Government underlined the willingness of the Scottish Government to work in collaboration to find a suitable solution that worked for the particular circumstances in Scotland, and we really don't seem to have got very far on this. And the Scottish Government have highlighted that while they appreciate the MHCLG have introduced the EWS1 form to bring about a resolution, this relies in some respects on a tenure system that does not exist in Scotland, and this needs to be addressed. So there are a number of properties in Glasgow Central where constituents have raised their concerns about this, and these include within the city Lansfield Quay, which has, because it was built in phases, has different issues across those phases. And the honourable member from East Ham, who raised earlier on about having different types on the one building, really highlights the issue that there needs to be consideration to the building as a whole, rather than just a specific one single type of cladding, as other honourable members have mentioned. And the Birdie building, the Templeton's building next to Glasgow Green, my constituent Lisa Jane Murray has been working incredibly hard to highlight the situation there as well, because there is non-compliant ACM on the top 2 floors alone of that building. And it was compliant at the time of construction and conformed to the regs in place when the building warrant was obtained, as far as they're aware. But it seems to be an issue where some of these things have been missed over time. There's also been a change to the building, which means that essentially there is a line of cladding up the side of the building, which would act almost as a chimney. So if there was to be a fire or something that happened at the bottom of that building, it would scoot up the outside of the building onto the top, which is terrifying, Mr Davies, and it has been incredibly difficult for the residents at the building to ascertain who is responsible for this now. Is it the original developer? Is it somebody that made the changes in between times? Is it the residents that have to take this up now and face the costs that other honourable members have mentioned? And it is incredibly difficult to make sure that we can get to a solution for this, and it's very important, particularly because this is based at Glasgow Green. There are lots of events there. It's a very busy part of Glasgow. So I would like to turn to some of the issues that are raised by Advice Note 14, and some of the issues around this about inspections needing to be carried out by a qualified certificated body have been hinted at by others earlier on, because there are capacity issues in the industry. As the Honourable Member for Hackney South and Shoreditch mentioned, perhaps we need to look at bringing more experts into the country to do this and make adjustments to immigration to do that as well, because the industry does not have the people to do this. Time is pressing, money is a factor here, and we need to look at an issue, a way of getting to this point. The new advice note, which was issued in consolidated advice note issued in January, brought in a fundamental change because it applied to all multi-storey and multi-occupied buildings, including those under 18 metres, which brings a whole load of extra buildings into scope. And according to Inside Housing, they also highlight this issue about an increased burden. They say compliance with the advice note and recovering costs both require expert evidence from a limited pool of fire engineers and forensic architects, and place an additional administrative and financial burden on building owners. So I would ask the Minister what she is doing to meet this challenge, because without the adequate people there to do this, we will be waiting for some long time since. And I would like to mention as well, just finally, that the issue of listening to residents is fundamentally important here. And Dame Judith Hackett mentioned that in Scotland, the Scottish Government had listened well to residents in order to forge a response. And there, the Scottish Government's Fire Safety Committee is still meeting and taking on concerns. And I would ask the Minister to listen closely to residents right across the country, to listen to MPs and to bring a response that meets those needs. It's clear that the fund being set up is far from adequate. It's far from wide enough in terms of what it encompasses. And the Minister needs to look at expanding this, and expanding this very soon, so that people can get on with the work of doing this. And lastly, I would echo the words of the member for Newton Abbott, who called for a VAT exemption. I've asked for this on multiple occasions now in the Chamber, to have this VAT exemption. The budget is coming up. There's an opportunity to do this, to remove VAT both from sprinkler systems and from cladding and house repair systems. If they were to do that, it would be a huge help to those looking to get work done quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have the pleasure of listening to my old friend from Croydon Central, Sarah Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and congratulations to my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, for securing what is clearly an incredibly important debate that we could spend many hours talking about, and that hopefully reflects the scale of the problem that we see right across the country. As you would expect, I spend quite a lot of time talking to leaseholders, whether it's through the all-party group on leasehold reform, or whether it's through the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership or the UK Cladding Action Group. I have had the privilege of talking to many of them about some of the issues that they're facing. These are lives that have been, as has been articulated so well, turned upside down completely, and for issues for which they bear no fault. But what they bear is the cost and the anxiety and the stress, and their lives are on hold, and it is incredibly upsetting for everyone who's been involved. It's nearly 1,000 days now since the Grenfell Tower fire, and since that time we've had 2 Prime Ministers, 3 Secretaries of State, 4 housing ministers, everything but a partridge in a pear tree. And tomorrow we may yet have another shuffle, which hopefully we won't actually, because we want the ministers and the Secretary of State to stay and fix some of these problems. Most of the issues have been very well explained today, so I want to focus on some particular questions to the Minister, and it would be really great if she doesn't have time to answer them all today, if she could write and come back to us. So the first point is about the remediation of ACM cladding, which we've talked about a lot. We know that 9 in 10 private blocks with Grenfell-style cladding are still covered in Grenfell-style cladding, which is... Yes, I will give
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? Just on that point of the fact that there are still several blocks with this ACM flammable cladding, my constituents in Battersea at Sesame Apartments are still living in a home wrapped in this unsafe cladding. So I do hope, does she agree with me, that when the Minister responds, that actually she responds and gives us some definitive deadlines as to when these private blocks will be made safe?
Absolutely, I completely agree with my honourable friend. We know that 75 private block owners don't even have a plan in place to remove this cladding. So can the Minister confirm today that, as the Secretary of State promised on the 20th of January, the government will name all block owners who failed to put a plan in place by the end of January, and will she publish those names in tomorrow's building safety update? Talking about the government's £200 million fund for ACM removal on private blocks, it's 9 months old, yet just a single block has so far been accepted for funds, and none have been made safe as a result of the fund. Labour has for years called on the government to legislate to ensure that building owners cannot pass costs on to innocent leaseholders. Even with the £200 million fund, leaseholders are still exposed to risk because state aid rules mean that fund payments are capped at €200,000 per property, as the Mayor of London National Housing Federation have already said. The fund only covers ACM cladding, creating a two-tier system. So can the Minister confirm what protections she is putting in place in the event that remediation costs exceed the state aid cap to ensure leaseholders aren't handed the bill? And what is she doing to protect those leaseholds in blocks with other forms of dangerous cladding from being unfairly passed those costs? Moving on to unsellable properties, research from Labour revealed last year that up to 600,000 people are now stuck in unsellable flats because of flawed government guidance relating to Advice Note 14, which is compounded by the failure to publish the government's tests into suspect non-ACM cladding. In recent weeks, we know there's been new advice issued and a new form from RICS, the EWS1 form, for buildings where the cladding status is uncertain. But in spite of those changes, over the last few days I've dealt with, and we've all dealt with probably, constituents who've been unable to complete the sale, in this case of her flat. She's facing major delays and bills over the work that she's been told needs to be done. So can the Minister give some clarity on how many sales are still being held up, how many EWS1 forms have successfully been signed off, and what the government is doing to ensure that leaseholders are not being ripped off for those forms? Moving on to Waking Watch, which other people have raised today. Interim safety measures like Waking Watch were put in place in the wake of Grenfell as a very temporary measure before remediation works were undertaken. But all this time on, nearly 1,000 days, leaseholders are still paying exorbitant costs, thousands of pounds per year, as a direct consequence of the government's failure to hold building owners to account and make their blocks safe. So can the Minister tell us what plans does she have to ensure leaseholders who can't afford to continue paying the costs are supported? Moving on to non-ACM and data collection. ACM, as we know, is the tip of the iceberg, and HPL cladding and other forms of cladding are just as dangerous and should be removed. But yet, 2 years on, ministers have failed to audit residential blocks, meaning we still don't know how many blocks are covered in HPL or other types of potentially lethal cladding. Ministers promised this work would be completed by March this year, but an Inside Housing investigation report revealed that 70% of blocks remain uninspected, meaning it's virtually impossible to reach that deadline. It is becoming ridiculous that often the government have shifted their deadline on publication of the non-ACM test results. So can the Minister today commit to a date for the publication of the tests or explain to us the reason for the delay? Yes.
Delay in getting the data in, doesn't this just speak again to the lack of expertise available? When I was speaking to one of my housing associations at the end of last week, they're having to assess their buildings in risk order, so that there are many people who are not such risky buildings, but they're never going to get the work done to get the paperwork necessary, the data that they need, in their case, to get mortgages, but indeed also important for the property owners.
That is absolutely correct. There is a whole raft of areas where different evidence is gathered, where different work needs to be done. You know, there are questions about all of these aspects. You know, the people that are doing Waking Watch is one example. We don't really know that they're all doing it properly and that they're all properly trained, and we're spending money for things that we're not sure about. So the lack of people to do these jobs is very important. Finally, just on the ACM blocks that are between 11 and 18 metres, the announcement on the 20th of December that the height limit for removing ACM had shifted from 18 metres to 11 metres means that there are potentially thousands more blocks implicated in the cladding scandal than originally thought. This means tens of thousands more leaseholders who'd previously thought their blocks were safe now discover that their work needs to be done and that their building is not now deemed safe by the government. So while any additional safety requirements are welcome, of course, when it comes to building safety, it's unclear why the government took 2.5 years to decide that buildings between 11 and 18 metres were equally unsafe. So can the Minister clarify why it took so long to determine that blocks of this height should also have their cladding removed, whether the department knows how many residential blocks exist across the country between 11 and 18 metres, how many of those blocks are covered in Grenfell-style cladding, and on the latter point, if the government doesn't know how many blocks are covered, is there a plan in place to collect and publish this information as has been done with blocks of 18 metres or above? So 2.5 years we've had a merry-go-round of buck passing, and there are hundreds of thousands of people across the country who are suffering as a result. It's disappointing that the Secretary of State, was asked about this, wasn't asked about this more when he was out doing the media rounds at the weekend, and it's disappointing that we haven't seen more action. It's also disappointing that the government isn't engaging with leaseholders. There was a meeting in London recently organised by the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. 100 leaseholders were there. They were asked whether they've had regular engagement with ministers. Not a single hand went up. We need to be talking to people so we can understand the issues that they are facing. And finally, I would say if the government is serious about the claims that they made, in the pledges that they made in the days and weeks following the Grenfell Tower fire, if the government is serious about its role to keep people safe, if the government is serious about its commitment to homeowners, and if the government is serious about the principle that leaseholders are not the people who should be paying, it is time to act. And I know this is difficult, it's a very big problem, and it's going to be very complicated to solve, but if the government acts and does the right thing, we on this side of the House would thank you very much for doing so.
Thank you very much. Now I can invite Esther McVey, Minister, to answer all those questions, about 12 minutes, and perhaps allow a minute or so for Hilary Benn at the end. Thank you so much, Minister.
It's a real pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr Davis, and also to thank the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central for bringing this issue to Westminster Hall today. And what I want to say is thank all the members who have come here, because listening to the members here today, I think it really has shown MPs at their very best, bringing issues, cases, concerns, dilemmas to the floor to express what needs to be said here on behalf of constituents. And it's from all sides of the House who want to be here to voice those concerns. We all know that this is causing much stress, anguish to residents, and how do we support everybody in that? But I think people can also appreciate that issues are evolving as time goes on. And we also understand it is of no fault to the person who is the leaseholder, who bought their home, and now things have happened. And I think we all understand that really anybody could be one of those leaseholders, and it is happening to so many. So I actually want to praise what MPs are doing today to bring this forward. I will indeed.
On that point, that some of my constituents actually purchased properties under the Help to Buy. So the government certainly has a claim in this. And so how much of that responsibility will then therefore fall upon the Treasury?
A very well-made point by my honourable friend, and so I'm going to start with the words of the Secretary of State in January, where he said that we are currently considering options with the Treasury on the support that can go to leaseholders, and that is obviously an ongoing conversation, negotiations that are happening there, and I can go no further than that today. But what I will say, I will indeed.
I understand that, but she'll understand that while the conversation's on go, people at North Point are forking out 11,000 quid for every month the conversations they go on for. They have to be brought to an end and something happens soon.
And you know, I will thank my right honourable friend as well for raising that point. That's what I said. All MPs from all sides of the House are raising these points. But what I also want to make clear as well, that it was brought to everybody's attention after that terrible tragedy at Grenfell Tower, the fire risks with tall buildings, with cladding that hadn't been brought to people's attention before. And then I will also say, I will indeed.
With respect to the Minister, these issues were raised at the inquiry in the Leasehold Tower block in Southwark, I think, in South London, and there were recommendations made to the government then, and after the fire in Southampton, which I think took the lives of firefighters. Leasehold took the lives of 6 or 8 residents. Those recommendations were put forward. Grenfell would not have happened had the recommendations on building standards been put in place.
And we have to say, when the action that this government has taken has been, it was immediate, as soon as we did the report straight away, and then the actions that we took by having a comprehensive independent review of building safety, chaired by Dame Judith Hackett, and we've accepted all of those recommendations for Dame Judith Hackett's independent review of building safety, and will continue bringing forward legislation to deliver an enhanced safety regime for high-rise residential buildings. And as announced last month, we will immediately begin to establish the new building safety regulator, initially in shadow form, pending legislation, and Dame Judith Hackett will chair that board and oversee transitions to the new regime. I will indeed give way.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. She has paid a tribute to MPs for doing their best and showing the best of MPs today. What we hope to see today, Mr Davies, is the best of the Minister, that she will do the best by our constituents. And while we recognise the actions the government took after the Grenfell fire, what our residents need now is some assurance and some action, so they know that they don't have to wait years for this issue to be resolved. Is she able to give our constituents any comfort today?
And I started off with the lines of the Secretary of State of what we're doing, what actions we've taken, and how we are going to deliver those going forward. What I was making sure is people understood that, yes, the work that has gone on with the expert panel, the advice we're taking from that, the rigour of those, the work that is going on, the fact that it is checked, that it is verified, and that we are taking that forward at a pace that we can do it. So, of course, we are here today and we are discussing those issues. It is being dealt with. Those negotiations are going on. But what today absolutely impresses upon us is the importance and, as you say, the speed with which things need to be done, as thorough and as rigorously as it can possibly be done.
Giving way, and it's on this question of the pace at which things are being done. As chair of the all-party student group, I wrote to the Secretary of State after the Bolton fire about HPL cladding, and I got no response after 2 months. I raised it with him on the floor of the House, and he promised me an early response on the 20th of January. I still haven't had that response. So could the Minister give us some assurance in terms of when will the work being undertaken on the risks on HPL cladding be concluded, and does the government recognise the same uncertainty and worries that have been raised by many colleagues on both sides in relation to ACM cladding, raises exactly the same issues for HPL?
I will indeed take that message back and see what happened with that further correspondence from the Secretary of State. I do know that on behalf of the member for Glasgow Central, I believe the department replied to that letter on the 6th of February. So if she hasn't already got it, it will be with her very shortly. So, and again, I will take that back and check on that. I will go through exactly what we have done, how we have done it, the significant steps we have taken, whether that was bring forward £600 million to support people, the further work that is being done, that is being led by an expert panel, of which we then have followed, whether it was even the independent review, of which we have accepted all of the recommendations there, and how we go forward at a pace that is rigorous and at a pace that we can do, and obviously at a timing once we've had all of those negotiations too with the Treasury. But if I talk about, what we did in December 2018 when we banned the use of combustible materials in external walls of new high-rise buildings, and then when we'd done a ban, we checked the ban's effectiveness, and then in January we launched a consultation on that ban, and that went further. That did it need to lower from 18 metres below that to 11 metres, and then the government also delivered the fire safety bill and associated regulated changes, and able to deliver the recommendations of the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 1 report. So I will indeed.
Lady, for the extensive detail that she's given us. But will she address the point I made very gently in my contribution? It's not enough time, even if we give the Honourable Lady another 5 minutes to say what she's saying. It's not enough time to address all the issues that's been raised today. And there were many issues that weren't raised today simply because of the lack of time. Will the government consider giving us a proper debate, a full-length debate on the floor of the House, so that we can express ourselves better and hear from the Minister more comprehensively?
And I think the Honourable Lady has raised a very good point there. We do need to have more time to debate this. This was a 90-minute debate, and as I said, it showed by how many people are here that there wasn't enough time with everybody. I actually think not only should we have the debate, but actually we all need to come together to work in a constructive fashion too, to raise these issues, bring it for the points forward, so we can work together on that, because you're quite right, the 90 minutes here today wasn't long enough. And also in response to that, we do need to, and we will, write back to the members who are here today, because I cannot in the time given be able to give a full comprehensive response to everybody. So I will indeed do that.
Can I thank the Minister for giving me way? And I absolutely take her point in what she's saying about making sure, that we all get to express ourselves and you can hear all our points. What's been glaringly obvious from a lot of this engagement are leaseholders do not believe that they're being listened to or heard from by ministers. So will the Minister commit today to ensuring that she will meet with leaseholders and some of my constituents so that she can hear firsthand from them exactly the concerns that they are facing in relation to their homes being wrapped in unsafe cladding?
I know the department has been meeting with leaseholders, and I know that we have taken letters and replied to leaseholders, but I think you are right, again, that we do have to have a bigger consultation and ensure that we meet with leaseholders. And I know Lord Younger met with a group, I believe it was yesterday. I can see, I believe some of those are here today, and it is imperative that we hear from the people who are most affected. So I absolutely agree that we should do that. Time is short, and I don't know whether the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central would like to have a minute or so at the end. So if I do take the interventions, if there are more to add, I will indeed.
I asked the question, Mr Davis, about the Migration Advisory Committee. Can the Minister tell us whether she's spoken to the Migration Advisory Committee, or will do, about making sure the right skills are able to do this work properly and quickly?
And that is absolutely imperative, that we have the people with the right skills able to do this job straight away.
Minister agreed that, in fact, we need to hear a little bit more, not just about how great it is that all of us have come here to talk about these things, but actually concrete actions. I want to be able to go back to my constituents in Ilford South and the 100 people in Raphael House who are having mental health issues, they're having problems planning their future, getting their kids into schools because of the situation where the freeholders essentially have them over a barrel. The time has now come to end these platitudes and actually take some action.
And the government did take an unprecedented step of bringing forward £600 million to support those people that the expert panel said were in the most dangerous buildings with ACM, PE cladding. And, as I said, and I started off with the words of the Secretary of State, of how do we ensure we have got the right support at the right place at the right time. But we have taken from the very start the advice of experts in this field, and that is what we are working to ensure that we support these leaseholders.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Davies. Can I thank all colleagues for the force and clarity of their argument. It's no good pretending that the leaseholders listening to this debate are not going to be very, very disappointed by the response they've heard. But I hope that the Minister will go back to these conversations with the Treasury and say, blimey, we're in a bit of a mess here. And these MPs on all sides of the House are not going to go away, because we'll be back. And we've got the budget coming up, and I hope on that day we will hear what the government is going to do to make sure leaseholders do not have to pay.
Order. Thank you very much.